A light tank's own gun could not punch through the front plate of the enemy it was sent to kill. That was true on paper in 1941, and it stayed true for most of the Desert War. And yet, within a single fighting season, crews driving that undergun tank worked out how to make a Panzer III burn, not by upgrading the gun, but by changing what the tank did in the 4 or 5 seconds after it spotted one. The tank was the M3 Stuart, American-built, British-crewed in its first combat, and small enough that German officers who captured one sometimes remarked on how little of it there was to shoot at. The trick that made it dangerous had nothing to do with armour thickness or shell weight. It had to do with movement, with a machine that could keep firing accurately while it was already running, at a moment in tank history when almost nothing else on either side could do that. This is the story of how a 12-ton light tank, dismissed by its own users as outclassed within a year of arriving in the desert, turned mobility itself into a weapon precise enough to kill tanks twice its size. The story starts with a number nobody in the American ordnance establishment wanted to publish out loud. The M3 Stuart's main gun was a 37mm, first the M5, then the slightly longer M6, firing a projectile that, under laboratory conditions, could put roughly 36mm of steel behind it at 500 meters, striking square on. That number held up fine against Italian light armour and early war German light tanks. It did not hold up against a Panzer III with appliqué plates bolted to its nose. The Panzer III variants the Afrika Korps fielded through 1941 and into 1942 carried frontal hull armour that had grown, generation by generation, from 30mm on the early Ausf, G to as much as 50 or even 60mm once bolt-on plate and the later Ausf. J hull were factored in. Turret mantlets ran thicker still. Against that kind of protection, a 37mm round arriving from anywhere near the gun's rated maximum range was, for practical purposes, wasted ammunition. The British crews who received the first Stuarts in the summer of 1941 did not need a penetration table to understand this. They found out in combat. 84 of them landed at Suez in July 1941 and went to the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars, part of the 4th Armoured Brigade, 7th Armoured Division. The other regiments of the brigade, the 3rd and 5th Royal Tank Regiments, were equipped soon after. British tank crews meeting the vehicle for the first time coined the name that stuck for the rest of the war. One tankman reportedly looked it over and said simply, "She's a honey." The nickname outlived the tactical assessment that came with it. Operation Crusader opened on November 18, 1941. Roughly 170 Stuarts went into that campaign as part of a British armoured force that numbered over 700 tanks in total. On paper, a meaningful advantage over Rommel's Afrika Korps. The next day gave the British their first real answer to the question of what a 37mm gun could do against Panzer III armour at normal engagement range. Near Gabr Saleh, the 8th Hussars ran into Kampfgruppe Stefan, built around Panzer Regiment 5 of the 21st Panzer Division. The exchange that followed was lopsided in a direction the British had not planned for. The Hussars lost roughly 20 Stuarts. German records credit the destruction of perhaps 2 or 3 tanks in return. A couple of Panzer IIIs, 1 Panzer II. By the following evening, only about 98 of the brigade's original 165 Stuarts were still running. That ratio, 20 lost for 2 or 3 killed, is the kind of number that ends careers and rewrites doctrine. It did both, eventually. But it did not happen instantly. And it did not happen because anyone replaced the gun. Under Lend-Lease, Britain would eventually receive roughly 1,784 of the original M3 model, and a further 1,594 of the improved M3A1, a substantial commitment of American industrial output to a design that, within a year of its combat debut, its own users were already describing as outclassed. That commitment is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains why nobody simply withdrew the tank after Gabr Saleh. There was no immediate replacement in the pipeline in the quantities the Eighth Army needed, and the crews who had just watched 20 of their own burn in an afternoon were going to keep fighting in Stuarts whether a better answer existed or not. It happened because the men still alive after Gabr Saleh started asking a different question than the one the penetration tables answered. The tables asked, at what range can this gun defeat that armour fired from a stationary position, square on? That was the wrong question for the crews who intended to survive the next engagement. The right question, worked out through loss rather than instruction, was narrower and more brutal. Not can this gun kill a Panzer III. It plainly could. The post-war tests proved that beyond argument, penetrating the turret front at 300 yards and the whole sides at 600 in trials against a captured example. The real question was where and how close, and whether the Stuart could be doing something a Panzer III commander did not expect while it fired. The Panzer III's weakness was never really the frontal plate. It was everything that wasn't the frontal plate. Hull sides ran around 30 mm through most of the Desert War's Panzer III variants. Turret sides were similar. Rear plate, protecting the engine deck, was thinner still on several models. A 37 mm round that could not touch 50 or 60 mm of glacis at any sane range went through 30 mm of side armour without much argument, provided the range was short enough that dispersion and residual velocity weren't working against the gunner. 600 yards for the sides, closer for anything approaching the rear quarter. That was the geometry the trick depended on. The Stuart's own armour followed a version of the same logic for reasons that had nothing to do with any German design choice. Riveted and cast in thicknesses running from about 25 mm on the hull sides and rear up to 44 mm on the lower front hull and 51 on the gun mantelet, the tank was built heavier in front than to the sides. The same directional bet every tank in the Desert War was making, because every designer assumed the enemy would mostly be somewhere ahead of the barrel rather than off to one side. That assumption is exactly what a closing angled Stuart run was built to punish on the German side of the fight, and exactly what a German gunner who got a clean flank shot could punish right back. Getting to that geometry against a Panzer III that was actively trying to kill you required closing distance across open desert while under fire, and doing it fast enough that the German gunner whose own 50 mm gun could reach out well past 1,000 meters with real effect didn't get a clean stationary shot first. This is where the Stuart's other characteristics stopped being liabilities and started being the plan. The M3 and its improved successor, the M3A1, were fast. Road speeds around 36 miles per hour were realistic for the type, noticeably quicker than the Panzer III across most terrain, and quick enough that a Stuart troop spotted at long range had a genuine chance of covering the ground to effective side shot distance before the German crew could reposition or the gunner could walk a second round onto target. Speed alone does not explain the trick, though. A tank charging toward an enemy position at 30 plus miles per hour is also a tank whose own gun is bouncing on rough desert ground, and a stationary target hits a moving one far more easily than the reverse. In 1941 and for most of 1942, virtually every tank gun in the Desert War, American, British, German, Italian, required the vehicle to stop before the crew could expect a first-round hit at any real range. Fire on the move was, for practical gunnery purposes, fire that missed. The M3A1 changed that math, in a narrow but real way. Beginning with production in May 1942, the M3A1 carried a vertical gyro-stabilizer built into the 37mm gun's mount, reportedly the first system of its kind fitted to an American tank in series production. It did not turn the Stuart into a precision weapon at range. What it did was let the gunner keep the barrel roughly on target while the hull was moving, instead of losing the sight picture completely every time the tank crossed a rut or a wadi lip. Combined with the 37mm high rate of fire, that meant a Stuart gunner could afford to put out several rounds during a closing run and expect at least one of them to land somewhere useful, rather than needing to halt, aim, and offer the German gunner a stationary target in return. None of this made the M3A1 accurate by later war standards. What it did was collapse the advantage a Panzer III crew normally had over anything trying to close the range on them. A gun that could put rounds downrange while running was a gun that did not have to choose between moving and shooting. And in a fight where survival depended on covering ground before the enemy's longer-ranged 50mm found its mark, that was the entire difference. Put the pieces together and the tactic looks almost simple in hindsight. Spot the Panzer III before it spots you, or accept that you won't. Use the Stuart's speed to cut the range hard and at an angle rather than head-on. Keep the gun roughly on target throughout the run using the stabilizer, so the enemy commander cannot assume you'll go quiet while closing. Arrive inside 600 yards, ideally closer, ideally off the frontal arc. Put the round into the side plate or the rear deck rather than the glacis nobody's 37mm was defeating that year. And be moving again, away from where you fired before the German turret, traversed by hand on most Panzer III variants, could bring the 50mm back around. None of that was written into the tank destroyer manuals the crews had trained on. It was closer to something learned the way a driver learns a dangerous road, by surviving the first few passes and remembering exactly what almost got you killed. The tactic also depended on a resource nobody could manufacture more of once the fighting started: fuel. The Stuart's compact hull carried enough for roughly 70 to 100 miles before it needed refueling, a real constraint in a desert campaign built around long, fast advances and equally fast withdrawals. A troop that had just burned a tank's worth of tactical fuel on repeated closing runs against a Panzer III screen might win the local exchange and still find itself stranded, immobile and out of options if the wider battle shifted before the fuel trucks caught up. Mobility bought the kills. It also had a meter running the entire time, and the meter didn't care how the engagement had gone. There is a wider comparison worth making here because the Stuart did not fight the Panzer III in isolation. Italian M13/40 tanks present in North Africa in large numbers through 1941 and 1942 carried armour the Stuart's 37mm could defeat cleanly at ranges where the Panzer III's plates simply shrugged the same round off. A reminder that the entire closing and flanking tactic existed because the Panzer III specifically had outgrown the gun built to kill it, not because every tank on the Axis side had. Against the Italians, the Stuart didn't need the trick. Against the Germans, the trick was the only thing that made the gun relevant at all. Major Robert Crisp, commanding a troop and later a squadron of Stuarts with the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment during Crusader, lived that lesson about as directly as a man can, and still write a memoir about it afterward. Over the course of the campaign he had 6 tanks shot out from under him and kept fighting. He came out of it with the Military Cross, the Distinguished Service Order, and 4 mentions in dispatches, decorations that do not get handed out for tanks that sat still and lost gunnery duels at range. His account of the fighting, published after the war as Brazen Chariots, remains one of the more widely read first-hand records of what armoured combat in the Western Desert actually felt like, from inside a 12-ton hull with a 37mm gun and no illusions about its frontal capability. Crisp wrote his account of Crusader almost as a diary, kept during the roughly 1 month of fighting before he was wounded and evacuated, which is part of why Brazen Chariots reads less like a campaign history and more like a log of decisions made in the seconds before contact, the kind of detail that rarely survives into official after-action reports. 6 tanks is not a figure that fits comfortably into any tidy account of a winning tactic. It is the cost of running that tactic repeatedly, engagement after engagement, against an enemy that kept learning too. The tanks Crisp lost were not lost because the trick failed. They were lost because the trick had a price built into it, and the price was paid in tanks, not in doctrine. Closing to 600 yards or less against a Panzer III meant spending several seconds inside a range band where the German 50mm could also hit hard, and where German thermite ammunition, when it connected, tended to set a Stuart burning in a way that gave the crew very little time to get out. The tactic reduced the odds against the Stuart. It did not remove them. Some historians assessing the campaign afterward concluded that the heavy Stuart losses during Crusader had less to do with any inherent flaw in the tank, and more to do with the training and battle experience the Afrika Korps already possessed, which meant German crews were often quicker to recognise a closing Stuart for what it was, and quicker to respond than the tactics inventors would have liked. There is a detail in the post-war assessments that cuts against the tank's reputation as a death trap, though it rarely gets mentioned alongside the loss figures. Examinations of Stuarts after action reported that the armour plate itself, where it was hit, tended to perform well against the calibers it was actually facing. Testers found no clean penetrations of the front glacis or the gun shield in the cases reviewed, with the vehicle's vulnerability concentrated instead in the thinner side and rear plate, exactly where the tank's own gun was also most effective against the enemy. The Stuart, in other words, had been built with the same geometry of strength and weakness as the tank it was hunting, thick where it faced forward, thin everywhere else. That symmetry did not last the way the men fighting in the summer of 1941 might have hoped it would. By the spring of 1942, the same iterative pressure that had pushed Panzer III armour from 30mm up toward 50 and then 60 kept moving. The Ausf arrived with solid 50mm whole front plate as standard, no longer relying on bolted-on supplements, and a lengthened 50mm KWK 39L/60 gun, replacing the earlier shorter-barreled weapon. The longer gun meant a flatter trajectory and more penetrating power at the ranges where a Stuart's closing run began, which meant the window during which a Stuart could cross open ground without being hit first got shorter, not longer, as the campaign wore on. At Gazala in May 1942, Stuarts fought alongside the newly arrived M3 Grant, whose 75mm gun could finally threaten a Panzer III's front plate at something approaching normal combat range. After that battle, British armoured doctrine increasingly pushed the Stuart out of the tank versus tank role it had been forced into during Crusader and toward reconnaissance and screening work. The job its speed and small silhouette suited it for. Without asking its gun to do something a 37mm round was never going to do, reliably against up-armoured, up-gunned German tanks for the rest of the war. There was a cost on the German side too, one that shows up less in tank recognition manuals than in the habits Panzer III crews had to unlearn. A tank designed to dominate the frontal arc, with a commander trained to assess an oncoming threat by its silhouette and stated gun caliber, had to start treating small, fast, nominally outgunned vehicles on the flank as an active threat rather than a formality, scanning ground it had previously been able to ignore, holding formation more tightly with neighbouring tanks so no single vehicle presented an isolated flank. None of that shows up as a kill credited to a Stuart crew. All of it came from the same handful of engagements where the trick worked well enough to be noticed and remembered. The tactic that had let Stuart crews trade for Panzer III's during Crusader did not stop working because the idea was flawed. It stopped working because the gap it exploited, the moment when a Panzer III commander could not reasonably expect the vehicle closing on him to keep landing hits while it ran, narrowed as German gunnery and armour both improved and as more capable American tanks arrived to take over the job the Stuart had been doing at a steep cost. What survived the campaign, in the units that fought it and in the doctrine that grew out of their losses, was not a weapon. It was the outline of an idea that a tank whose gun cannot win a stationary duel at range can still win the fight, provided it refuses to offer that duel, provided it treats the seconds it spends closing distance as combat time rather than dead time, and keeps its gun working through every one of them. Chrysler built the M3 Stuart as a light reconnaissance tank, not a tank killer. Nobody in American ordnance in 1940 designed the 37mm gun's ballistics around a Panzer III side plate specifically, and nobody wrote the gyrostabilizer into the M3A1 with Gabr Saleh in mind. It arrived in production nearly 6 months after that battle had already taught British crews what a stationary gunfight against a 50mm gun cost them. The tactic came afterward, assembled in the field out of whatever the machine could actually do by men who had already watched the alternative fail. A Panzer III commander in the winter of 1941 could look at a distant Stuart, check its silhouette against a recognition chart, and reasonably conclude that nothing about the vehicle's stated specifications threatened him from the front. He would have been right about the specifications. He would have found out, if the range closed fast enough and the angle was wrong for him, that the specifications were never the whole fight. That the 30 seconds it took the Stuart to cross from the edge of his effective range to inside its own were not 30 seconds of safety, just because his own gun's numbers said they should be. 6 tanks lost under one commander, 20 lost in a single afternoon near Gabr Saleh, a nickname earned in an instant that outlasted the tactical judgment behind it. The ledger on the Stuarts' desert war is not a clean one, and it was never going to be. Given what the tank was and what it was asked to do against armour it was never built to beat head-on. But somewhere in that ledger sits a simpler fact, one that outlived the tank's reassignment to scouting duty by the summer of 1942. For one campaign season, against one of the most capable tanks in the German inventory, crews driving a machine with a gun that could not beat the enemy's front plate at any range worth naming still found a way to make that gun matter, by refusing to stand still long enough to lose. The number that opened this story is still true. A 37mm round fired square into a Panzer III's glacis from any range a manual would call sensible was not going to end that tank's war. It never became true in reverse either. Nobody ever handed the Stuart a gun that could win the fight the specification sheets described. What changed was which fight the crews agreed to have, and how many seconds they were willing to spend inside the range where the specification sheets stopped mattering at all.